Imagine a city so corrupt, it was wiped out by God himself. But what if the real reason isn't what you've always heard? Cities of unimaginable wealth, societies that looked glorious on the outside. But what was really going on behind? The walls of Sodom and Gomorrah? What made them so detestable in God's eyes? What triggered the most devastating destruction in biblical history? Extreme luxury, endless parties, out-of-control riches. But behind those golden facades, a dark underworld of cruelty the Bible only hints at. Uncover the hidden secrets that sparked divine wrath, a cautionary tale that still echoes today. Hit like and subscribe to the channel. You've probably heard of Sodom and Gomorrah. For most people, those names bring up images of fire, sin, and judgment. But do we really get what was going on there? Was the filth of those cities just about sexual behavior, like we've always been told? Or is there something way deeper behind this ancient story? Let's take a look at how a lot of what went down in those old cities might have some pretty unsettling parallels with our world today. Are we, in some way, heading toward a modern Sodom? Think about that while we break down every part of the downfall of these infamous cities. And remember, this isn't just a story about destruction. It's a powerful warning about what happens when a society totally ditches divine principles. So let's kick off our journey with the first thing that made Sodom and Gomorrah so corrupt: their wild prosperity and the arrogance that came with it. Sitting in the lush valley of Siddim, near the Dead Sea, Sodom and Gomorrah had a prime location that made them insanely rich trade centers. The Bible describes the region as well-watered everywhere, like the garden of the Lord, Genesis 13:10, showing just how naturally abundant it was, something you didn't see much in the ancient world. That natural wealth plus key trade routes turned these cities into real-life paradises of luxury. But over time, all that material success bred a collective arrogance that became the trademark of Sodom and Gomorrah's people. Ezekiel 16:49 spells it out. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She and her daughters were arrogant, overfed, and unconcerned. Imagine cities where people thought they were untouchable, where wealth wasn't a blessing but a right, and pride replaced gratitude. The Sodomites flaunted their riches in crazier and crazier ways, building huge mansions and throwing parties that lasted for days. But their arrogance went way beyond just showing off. They actually believed they could get away with anything. Who could ever judge us, they thought, while openly ignoring any sense of morality or divine law. It was a vicious cycle. The richer they got, the more they thought they were above any kind of judgment, human or divine. Can you imagine living in a place where everyone thinks they're totally above the law? And here's the kicker. Instead of their wealth bringing them closer to God in gratitude, it pushed them further away from any kind of divine principle. They forgot where their blessings came from, and in their arrogance started making up their own rules. But that so-called freedom was really just a deep moral slavery that would soon show up in other parts of society. And that's exactly what we're about to see, how all that wealth and arrogance led to devastating social inequality. While Sodom and Gomorrah's elite lived in unimaginable luxury, there was an underworld of poverty and misery that rarely gets mentioned in popular stories. Rabbinic accounts and apocryphal texts talk about a society deeply divided, where the rich not only ignored the poor, but straight up despised them. Picture walking down Sodom's golden streets. On one side, endless feasts. On the other, people starving to death. That was daily life. Jewish tradition keeps some shocking stories about how the poor were treated in these cities. In Sodom, it was actually illegal to give alms or help out needy strangers. Any act of kindness was harshly punished, creating a system where cruelty was basically the law. Beggars were often mocked in public, sometimes forced to play humiliating games for the rich's entertainment just to get a few crumbs. The prophet Ezekiel calls out this attitude. Now this was the sin of your sister Sodom. She did not help the poor and needy. Ezekiel 16:49. This wasn't just neglect. It was a deliberate policy of cruelty. Sodom's courts were notorious for always siding with the rich, while the poor had zero access to justice. Have you ever wondered what it would be like to live in a place where your basic human dignity is denied just because you're poor? This contempt for the vulnerable extended to travelers and foreigners too. They were seen as fair game for exploitation and violence. The biblical story of Lot offering hospitality to the visiting angels, Genesis 19, shows just how radical his kindness was compared to Sodom's social norms. But this extreme inequality was just a symptom of something deeper, the systemic corruption that had taken over every part of these cities' governments. And that's what we're talking about next. In Sodom and Gomorrah, corruption wasn't just a problem. It was the whole foundation of the government. Imagine courts where judges openly auctioned off their verdicts to the highest bidder, where laws were written specifically to benefit the powerful. Midrashic texts describe 4 judges in Sodom, each more corrupt than the last, with names that literally meant liar, forger, perverter, and law twister, a clear sign that justice was totally upside down. Historical accounts suggest Sodom had an elaborate system of legalized extortion. Merchants who wanted to do business there had to pay outrageous protection fees to local officials. Anyone who tried to speak out faced instant, often violent, retaliation. Corruption was so normal that people didn't even see it as wrong. It was just how things worked. Scripture calls out this systemic injustice in several places. The outcry that reached God, mentioned in Genesis 18:20-21, wasn't just about sexual immorality like people often assume, but about a total perversion of justice. The Hebrew word za'aka, outcry, is the same one used for the cries of the oppressed in Egypt, a cry for justice that rises to heaven. Can you imagine the despair of living in a society where there's absolutely no hope for justice? This systemic corruption created a vicious cycle. The more corrupt the system got, the more people lost faith in any idea of the common good or shared morality. Over time, this led to a total collapse of moral values, paving the way for the next stage of Sodom and Gomorrah's downfall. A hedonistic culture where chasing pleasure was the only law anyone cared about. But how did this anything-goes culture actually play out in daily life? That's what we'll find out next. On the streets of Sodom and Gomorrah, pleasure had become the only god anyone truly worshipped. Picture a society where the question, "Does this make me happy?" totally replaced, "Is this the right thing to do?" Wild parties that lasted for days were the norm, where stuffing yourself with food, drinking non-stop, and chasing every carnal pleasure was celebrated as the ultimate virtue. Historical accounts talk about feasts where wasting food was done on purpose. The more you threw away, the higher your social status. Cheating in marriage was so common that the very idea of loyalty became a joke. Ancient texts suggest that in Sodom, people who stood up for traditional family values were publicly mocked. Temples dedicated to pagan gods weren't just religious centers. They often hosted rituals that mixed worship with degrading sexual acts, sometimes involving ritual prostitution. The line between religious celebration and a full-blown orgy was totally erased. What made this situation especially disturbing wasn't just that these things happened, but the complete moral flip that came with it. Good was called evil, and evil was called good, just like it says in Isaiah 5:20. People who refused to join in weren't just left alone. They were actively hunted down and pressured to conform. Ever felt social pressure to drop your values? Now imagine that pressure cranked up to the max, where your actual safety depended on joining in. This hedonistic culture created a moral vacuum where literally anything was okay as long as it felt good in the moment. The Bible calls the people great sinners against the Lord. Genesis 13:13, meaning not just that sin was present, but that it was openly celebrated as a way of life. With zero moral boundaries, the next stage of Sodom's downfall was inevitable. A wave of violence that turned the cities into places of terror, especially after dark. So how did this violence show up in everyday life? When the sun went down in Sodom and Gomorrah, a reign of terror took over. The streets, which by day were all about business and showing off, at night became danger zones where violence wasn't just common, it was expected. Historical records and Jewish traditions talk about organized gangs, controlling different parts of the cities, enforcing their own twisted version of justice with brute force. Robberies, beatings, and murders happened so often they were just part of daily life. Foreigners and travelers were especially at risk. Not knowing the local ways, they often became easy targets. The Bible story of the angels visiting Lot, Genesis 19, paints this picture perfectly. The mob outside his house wasn't just trying to meet the visitors, but showing the kind of violent, degrading treatment outsiders got all the time. Imagine living with the constant stress of never feeling safe, where every corner could hide a deadly threat. What's even more disturbing is how this violence became normal and even celebrated. Instead of being condemned, brutality was often seen as a sign of power and dominance. Ancient texts suggest that in Sodom, anyone who showed compassion to victims was punished themselves. A twisted system of reverse justice took over, where victims were blamed and attackers protected, especially if they were part of the elite. This out-of-control violence showed a total lack of respect for human life and dignity. Might makes right replaced any idea of a society based on morals or ethics. Can you imagine living somewhere your safety depends only on your ability to defend yourself or pay for protection? This disregard for human life got even worse when it came to the most vulnerable, women and children. In Sodom and Gomorrah, dehumanization hit levels that are hard for us to even grasp. Women were systematically reduced to objects, seen mainly as property for men's pleasure or as baby makers. Historical sources say women in Sodom had no legal rights of their own and could be traded between powerful men like valuable goods. The idea of consent was basically non-existent, and violence against women was so common it barely got a reaction. Even more horrifying was how children were treated. In the society where pleasure and power were the only things that mattered, kids were the most vulnerable and the most exploited. Archaeological evidence from cities like Sodom shows child sacrifice tied to pagan cults, where kids were offered to gods like Moloch. Others were sold as slaves or abused in ways that make you question just how far human depravity can go when it's cut off from any moral anchor. This systematic objectification showed a totally warped view of humanity. Instead of being seen as made in God's image, Genesis 1:27, men, women and children were valued only for their usefulness or their ability to give pleasure or advantage. The weakest, elderly, sick, disabled were often abandoned or killed for being burdens to society. Have you ever stopped to think about how we treat the most vulnerable in our own world today? Dehumanization in Sodom got so bad that empathy itself, the ability to care about someone else's suffering, seemed to have been wiped out. And this wasn't by accident. It was actually encouraged through rituals and social practices that celebrated cruelty as entertainment. When a society loses all capacity for compassion, what's left? That's exactly what we'll talk about next. This total lack of solidarity. The streets of Sodom witness scenes every day that show just how little compassion people there had for each other. Picture a beggar collapsed on the side of the road, ignored by hundreds of people passing by, some even going out of their way to step on his outstretched hands. Midrashic texts tell shocking stories. like the one about a young woman who was executed in public just for giving bread to a hungry traveler. Her crime was showing mercy, something strictly forbidden by Sodom's unwritten rules. Jewish tradition preserves the tale of a special bed in Sodom used to accommodate visitors. If the traveler was too tall for the bed, his legs were cut off. If he was too short, they'd stretch him until he fit perfectly. This gruesome story perfectly sums up how Sodom's society forced everyone to conform to its twisted norms, wiping out any trace of individuality or compassion. Selfishness wasn't just accepted, it was the only way people knew how to interact. The rabbis teach that Sodom's final destruction wasn't sealed because of sexual sins, like many people assume, but because of a specific act of collective cruelty. The story goes that a young woman secretly gave food to a beggar for several days until she was caught. As punishment, she was covered in honey and left on a wall, where she died slowly, eaten alive by bees, while the townspeople watched for entertainment. Can you imagine a society where showing compassion gets you tortured in public? This total lack of solidarity had completely rotted the social fabric. There was no concept of the common good or collective responsibility, just a relentless pursuit of self-interest at any cost. The Bible describes how Abraham bargained with God to save Sodom, Genesis 18:23-33, but not even 10 righteous people could be found. It wasn't because the city was empty, but because the very ideas of justice and compassion had been systematically wiped out of everyone's minds. And it was this built-up moral decay that finally triggered a divine response. Dawn seemed normal in Sodom and Gomorrah on that fateful day. Shopkeepers opened their stores, pagan priests got their rituals ready, and the elite planned their nightly parties. No one had a clue it would be the last sunrise they'd ever see. The Bible describes what happened in a matter-of-fact way. Then the Lord rained down burning sulfur on Sodom and Gomorrah from the Lord out of the heavens, Genesis 19:24. It wasn't some random natural disaster, but a deliberate divine response to centuries of accumulated evil. Archaeological evidence around the Dead Sea points to a cataclysmic event around 1900 BC, maybe a massive earthquake that released natural deposits of bitumen, sulfur, and flammable gases. Some scholars think a meteor or asteroid might have exploded over the region, causing a literal rain of fire. Whatever the natural mechanisms, the biblical story makes it clear. This was an act of divine judgment, not an accident. The destruction was so complete that even today, no one knows exactly where those cities were. What makes this judgment especially significant is how exceptional it was. God didn't destroy these cities on a whim. The story shows a deliberate process, including investigation, I will go down and see, Genesis 18:21, and the chance for redemption through Abraham's bargaining. Destruction only came after. Every other possibility was exhausted, when it was clear that evil had become the very essence of those societies. Have you ever thought about how God balances mercy and justice in his actions? This event became a powerful symbol in Scripture, referenced over and over as a warning about the consequences of persistent, unrepentant sin. Jesus himself mentions Sodom as an example, Luke 17:29-30, and Peter writes that its destruction serves as an example of what is going to happen to the ungodly, to 2 Peter 2-6. But divine judgment wasn't just about destruction, it also included mercy for those willing to accept rescue, like Lot and his daughters. Still, not everyone who got the chance to escape managed to break free completely. Run for your life. Don't look back. These urgent words from the angel to Lot and his family, Genesis 19:17, mean way more than just a physical escape. It was a call to break completely with the lifestyle and values of Sodom. The order not to look back symbolized the need for a total break with a sinful past, but not everyone could make that clean break. Lot's wife, whose name isn't mentioned, in Scripture became one of the Bible's most powerful symbols. Lot's wife looked back, and she became a pillar of salt, Genesis 19:26. This short sentence hides a deep personal tragedy. She was physically leaving Sodom, but her heart was still stuck on the wealth, comfort, and social status she enjoyed in that doomed city. Her looking back wasn't just curiosity, it was attachment and nostalgia for what was being destroyed. The rabbis say she had become so assimilated to Sodom's culture that even with destruction at the door, she couldn't imagine a different life. Turning into a pillar of salt is packed with symbolism. Salt preserves, but it also sterilizes. She became a monument to the spiritual barrenness that comes from clinging to sin. Her frozen posture, forever looking back, is a visual warning to anyone trying to follow God while keeping one foot in the world they're supposed to be leaving behind. Jesus referenced this moment with the warning, "Remember Lot's wife," Luke 17:32, showing that this lesson goes way beyond its historical context. Have you ever caught yourself looking back on your own spiritual journey? Lot's wife's fate teaches us that salvation isn't just about where you are physically, but about real inner transformation. She was outside Sodom when she turned to salt, but spiritually she was still trapped in the city. Maybe that's the most relevant lesson for us today. We can be physically separated from sinful environments, going to church and using religious language, but our hearts can still be attached to values and practices God condemns. Truly escaping Sodom means a complete renewal of mind and heart. The story of Sodom and Gomorrah isn't just some historical account of ancient cities. It's a mirror that invites us to take a hard look at our own society and, more importantly, at our own hearts. When we think about the sins that led to these cities' destruction, arrogance, inequality, corruption, hedonism, violence, dehumanization, and a total lack of compassion, it's hard not to notice some pretty disturbing parallels with our world today. The real question isn't whether we live in Sodom, but how much Sodom we're letting live inside us. What does this story teach us about God's character? We see His holiness that can't coexist with ongoing evil, His justice that eventually answers the cries of the oppressed, but also His mercy that keeps reaching out, even when judgment is unavoidable. Abraham pleading for the cities, and God willing to spare them for just 10 righteous people, shows us a God who doesn't want destruction, but redemption. Lot and his daughters being saved proves that even in the middle of the harshest judgment, divine mercy is still at work. For each of us, the message is clear. We need to examine our own lives for the seeds of Sodom, attitudes, values, and behaviors that, if left unchecked, could lead us down the same path of separation from God. Are we growing compassion or indifference? Are we seeking justice or just looking out for ourselves? Do we value people as made in God's image, or do we see them as tools for our own benefit, like Lot's wife? Are we trying to follow God while still longing for the things He's calling us to leave behind? If this message spoke to your heart, show your support by hitting the like button and sharing it with someone who needs to hear it. And if you believe that Jesus is the only way to escape the judgment coming on our world, drop the words, "Jesus saves," in the comments. A powerful declaration in times like these. Don't forget to subscribe to the Biblical Memories channel so you don't miss out on more content that brings the scriptures to life and transforms hearts. And speaking of transformation, I've got a special invitation for you. Our next video tackles one of the most unsettling questions from Jesus' own words. Why will so many people hear Him say, "I never knew you," at the end of days? The answer might surprise you, and more importantly, it could keep those words from ever being said to you. Click the card popping up on your screen or the link in the description to find out this urgent truth. Just like Lot was rescued from Sodom, May we all be rescued from condemnation through a real relationship with Christ. See you in the next video, and may the peace of the Lord be with you.